Welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we explore the intersections of horror film and feminism. In this first series, we're bringing on special guests to dive deep into film and TV shows with witchcraft at the heart of them. I'm Anna, co-founder of the Final Girls and your podcast host. In this episode, we're going to be discussing Sam Raimi's comedy horror Drag Me to Hell, a film as bleak, gory and gross as it is poignant, funny, and at times quite heartfelt. Released in 2009, it marked Raimi's return to his horror origins after some time working on away from the genre, working on the first live-action Spider-Man franchise. Drag Me to Hell follows young loan officer Christine, as played by Alison Lohman, who, in order to prove to her boss that she can make the hard decisions, chooses not to extend an elderly woman's mortgage. In retaliation, the woman, who turns out to be a witch by the name of Mrs. Ganush, places a curse on Christine that, after 3 days of escalating torture, will plunge her into the depths of hell to burn for eternity. The film follows Christine's frantic attempts to rid herself of the curse and her constant, increasingly violent persecution by otherworldly creatures. I'm joined in this episode by Mary Wilde, the creator of the Projections lecture series, Applying Psychoanalysis to Film Interpretation, and the co-host of the Projections podcast with Sarah Cleaver. Mary and I will discuss different readings of Drag Me to Hell, so if you haven't seen the film, beware that spoilers will happen pretty much from the start. If you're not too fussed about those, do enjoy. It does get quite weird. Mary, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited for us to dig into this film.
Me too.
So, kind of to kick off at first, could you talk a little bit about your relationship with Drag Me to Hell?
Yeah, it's funny actually because this film was released in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't actually watch it when it was first released. I only happened to watch it only last year when I saw it pop up on Netflix. I think it was just like a very limited sort of run on Netflix. And I discovered it that way. So I didn't have any initial impressions of it when it first released at all. And I really liked it.
How do you think it's aged?
I think actually it's very I quite like the fact that it's sort of very high octane in the violence that it serves. It's almost slapstick. I don't even know how else to describe it. Some of it just feels so OTT.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like WTF moments, like what the fuck have I just seen? Like
It's very Sam Raimi.
It's very Sam Raimi.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people vomiting in each other's mouths.
A lot of projectile vomiting.
A lot
of projectile bleeding.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, a lot of that. So yeah, I think it is pretty much a horror comedy.
Exactly.
Although I remember going to the cinema in 2009, probably 2010.
Mm-hmm.
So still living in Spain at that time. And everything came about a year later. And going to the cinema and kind of being quite scared, like genuinely scared, but also laughing, which is that weird balance that very few people manage just to strike, and Sam Raimi, I think, is one of them, because he can create these moments of terror, but then insert some projectile vomiting and make it all fun again.
That's what's really amazing about this and unique. You're absolutely right, because for me, usually, I don't really take very well to jump scares. They usually either annoy me or I just find them like repetitive and redundant. But actually, I think in this film, it's very effective, just because first of all, the cinematography is so beautiful. So it's very watchable. And so you're suddenly drawn into this trance. Like I'm just imagining this scene where she's in the car and there's this like shawl or veil floating in the air. And then we just suddenly see her in the backseat of the car, like Mrs. Ganush in the backseat of the car. So it kind of draws you in and then it kind of punches you in the gut. I like that.
That was a great moment. It's a great soundbite. How would you describe the film for someone who hasn't seen it yet?
That's a good question. I think it's actually pretty accessible for people who don't usually watch horror, just because it's dealing in a subject that's pretty relatable. You know, people having ambitions to get promoted in their job, and those kind of feelings of not fitting in and wanting to belong. So it's kind of pretty universal themes. But the whole bit with Mrs. Ganush, and is she really a witch, and is she an occultist, and what's going on, what's at the center of this drama, it's good enough and sort of cinematic enough that it would engage probably a lot of mainstream audiences. I would say it's one of those films that for non-horror fans I would recommend, because it is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And because this series is entirely focused on kind of witches on screen, both in film and television, kind of brings me neatly to the question of, do you think Mrs. Ganush, who's the main antagonist of the film, is she a witch in your opinion?
I had a thought about that as I was watching the film, actually, because it's not that straightforward. I think in the classic sense, yes, she is, because she is an occultist and is capable of manipulating the supernatural powers to benefit herself or to manipulate other people. And those are some of those tropes that we've heard and seen about witches. I just also noticed that the film seems to exploit some derogatory representations of the term witch, relating particularly to older assertive women. So like the old tropes of the battle axe and the old hag, you know,
the crone.
The crone, exactly. And also there was just also this thing about women being pitted against each other, like, you know, and she cast this curse or hex on her. So there are those kind of gendered preconceptions, I think, about an embittered older woman who is sort of, I don't know whether it's consciously played out or if it's done in a critical way. It's hard to pinpoint, but I do think she's a witch. Yeah.
Good. Okay, good. Because I was a bit always on the fence about this film, because I always read her as a witch because of how she's presented. When I was rewatching it, there's so much talk about demons and the Lamia, and kind of that is the actual supernatural entity that's chasing down Christine, the protagonist. But Mrs. Ganush, the way that she's presented as well, the first time we see her, we just see her hand tapping on the table,
and her nails, they're like decaying.
There's this huge close-up of her hand, which are just these crusty old horrible nails. And she's very much kind of characterized as a witch with warts, and you can almost imagine her having a bubbling cauldron somewhere. And how do you think she fits into kind of our idea of an on-screen witch?
I think that those characteristics are definitely played up, and we're kind of invited into that. I guess the folklore of how witches have been presented before, she could almost be out of like the Wizard of Oz. Like she has those characteristics of wanting to do harm and being malignant and kind of exploiting her access to the supernatural world to seek revenge. But what's also interesting is that I was prompted to think about the catalyst, you know, the central conflict of the film, and that the crux of the film really is this tension between a young professional woman who has, you know, who appears to have the temerity to shame an older person and strip them of their basic dignity, which is the right to a place to live, because Mrs. Ganush is asking for an extension on her mortgage, on her bank loan. And she then, you know, she comes to the bank asking for an extension on her mortgage, and she's effectively told that she cannot have more time. And that to me is interesting, because it's as if it could almost be an allegory about an elderly subject who's begging for a prolonged life. Like she's reaching the end of her life and she's begging for more time. And time is here represented in extension. And she desperately wants more time to be alive. And her home is, you know, secures that for her. And so Christine, who sometimes is referred to throughout the film as like just a farm girl, she has this kind of connection as being like down to earth or connected somehow to nature and to the earth. Like she makes that harvest cake. And it's like when she refuses to bend the laws of nature, it's that old kind of like mythological battle between human beings who are at the end of their life and they begrudge nature for not allowing them more time. And this takes on, I think the witch trope is just like a very convenient metaphor to represent that.
It's so fascinating because one of the kind of recurring things that I keep seeing and rewatching and rethinking my own opinions about a lot of these films, a lot of them are older women who, and as witches, a lot of, not their power, but their goal is to not just extend their life, but extend their ability to enjoy life, whether that is through their beauty or youth or just, being able to walk around and live deliciously, to quote a previous film we discussed.
Ooh, I love it.
Yeah, it's from The Witch, the Robert Eggers film, and it just stuck in my mind today. First, to talk a little bit more about that incident where Christine and Mrs. Ganush meet, because it's such a power struggle in a way.
Mrs. Ganush. I'm sorry, Mrs. Ganush, but another extension on the loan is out of the question.
What?
I would like to help, but it is in the bank's...
No, please. This is my home. Where will I live?
You list your granddaughter as a reference. Maybe you could stay with her.
I would not burden her.
And there are several fine assisted living facilities for
A
the
nursing home? No, I would never live in one of those places.
I'm really sorry.
I am proud woman, Miss Brown, and never have I begged for anything. But now, I beg for you. I humble
Ganush,
myself
Mrs.
before
Ganush,
you.
please
I,
stand
Sylvia Ganush, beg on my mother's grave. I beg you.
Please let go. Let go! Security! Stop!
Over here, Billy. Over here. We're coming.
Shame.
It is.
And Christine, who is presented from the very beginning as someone who is quite insecure but ambitious, but definitely being sort of taken advantage of and puppeteered around by her boss, her slimy co-worker, feels a bit inadequate because she's referred to as the girl from the farm by her boyfriend's parents, who were told later on, and it's implied that they're very well off.
Yeah.
And they don't consider her to be of an equal social standing to their son. So there's a lot of that insecurity, and that's when she meets Mrs. Ganush. And it's that kind of power struggle that you were talking about, of someone who's young and beautiful, but still not quite in their power yet.
Wow, yeah.
Being confronted by someone who is presented as weak, but is actually secretly extremely powerful. At that moment where Mrs. Ganush steps down on her knees and she begs, is so really kind of creepy. I found it a lot creepier rewatching it for this.
It's kind of devastating.
It really is. Because, kind of witches are such icons of power that to see one reduced to begging for something is...
It's shattering.
Yeah, for something as shallow in a way.
Yeah.
But so hugely important.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's so beautifully put. The kind of paradoxes in both of them that are reflected in each other. And in a way, I think that Christine, being also just her name, like suggesting, it sounds like, Christ or Christianity. To me, that makes sense. There's this kind of timeless battle between the pagans and Christians that seems to also play on a certain layer in the film in terms of faith and in terms of what's acceptable in terms of beliefs, but also the fact that absolutely, her social standing leaves a lot to be desired in her perception of how her boyfriend's family functioned, or she overhears that conversation that makes her feel uncomfortable, makes her feel doubtful about whether she'd be accepted in their family. So in that sense, she's kind of abject. She's sort of in the margins, and she desperately longs just to fit in. That can work on multiple levels too, because we hear that in the past she was overweight, or she felt insecure about being heavier. So she physically couldn't fit in, and so this plays on her mind as well. Now, as an adult, she still feels abject, and the abjection plays itself in the body horror. So this to me makes me think of Julia Kristeva's book, Powers of Horror, where she talks at length about abjection being in relation to the disgusting bits relating to vomiting, nosebleeds, all the body fluids, those bits of our body that might be decaying or repulsive when we're confronted with them, bits of filth and everything that's taboo, basically. And in a way, she's kind of taboo because she doesn't quite fit in. And also, Kristeva talks about the abject in the sense of that space between the horror element being located in a space between being a subject and an object, being a human being with autonomy, but transgressing those boundaries and moving towards being dead, being an object, but not quite reaching that space yet. You're kind of undead. And that's the power of horror.
And that's quite interesting because it's literally where Christine finds herself once she is cursed by Mrs. Ganush. She's sort of, her eyes are opened up to the horrors of the supernatural, and she's being chased down by this creature conjured by Mrs. Ganush called the Lamia.
The Lamia.
So a lot of even the violent acts that happen to her, or the visions she has, which are all very physical, feel otherworldly. So it's like that in between her being alive and her own person, and then becoming, being quite literally dragged to hell.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. God. We talked about it a little bit before about being kind of funny and good respites for people who might, get really scared by more kind of hardcore horror films. That this has an element of humor to it. Yeah. But it is extremely gross. Oh, yeah. Essentially, there's a lot of fluids.
It's a real gross out. Yeah.
So kind of what did you make of, what's your reading of those body horror elements that are so present in the film?
The one thing that really stands out in my mind is the bit where Mrs. Ganush rams her entire arm inside Christine's mouth.
Yes, I'd completely forgotten about that bit until I rewatched it.
Yeah, it really takes you by surprise. Yeah. Because it's almost to the point of being kind of camp horror, but at the same time, it kind of makes you retch a bit, like it's really gross. And I couldn't help but think of it as almost like a monstrous blowjob. Just in the sense that like Mrs. Ganush is this really powerful witch.
That's not at all anything that anybody searches for on PornHub ever. Mary.
Oh, yeah. So that's like, PornHub if Barbara Creed was the curator, monster.
Oh my God.
The monstrous feminine on.
Yeah. That is a niche I did not know niche. I needed to know about in my life. But thank you.
I think there'd be a lot of takers.
That's amazing. PornHub is curated by Barbara Creed.
But yeah, like it's just because she's so powerful, she is so incredibly powerful, and she is kind of in possession of something supernatural that is so dominating. In psychoanalysis, anytime like there's a talk about power structure and centers of power that hoard all the power, we're talking about the phallus. So it has nothing to do, of course, with the male organ. It's just here the witch is very much in possession of the supernatural phallus that she imposes on Christine to kind of violate her as an act of revenge. And so again, it kind of, breaks down this, I guess, tension and conflict between maybe paganism and Christianity, particularly because the Alison Lohman character, we see that she is kind of a good person. She harbors a lot of guilt about what, that incident at the bank. She doesn't just kind of like dismiss it.
No, she doesn't let it go.
No.
And she doesn't feel at ease with herself until in the last scene, she very openly and verbally takes responsibility, says that I could have let her have the mortgage, but I chose not to for my own reasons, for my own selfish reasons.
Yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking because we see that her colleague that she works with is a real brown noser.
Stu. Yeah. Never trust a Stu.
No.
No offense to any Stus.
And it's just, we can see that she's clearly capable of doing the job. She produces excellent reports, she's intelligent, she's capable. And she's put by her manager in this kind of awkward situation where she has to make tough decisions and demonstrate aggressive characteristics, which she really struggles with. Yeah.
She's always sort of minimized as well by both her coworker and her manager, where they sort of, oh God, this scene really made me angry. It's not even a horror scene, but it's the part where she is talking to her manager and she's sort of, doing the things that she thinks she needs to do to get the promotion, and he sends her off to get him lunch, and it's obviously humiliating, but she agrees because he's her manager. And Stu comes along and gives her an order and then says she didn't get it right in front of her manager, even though that's not true. There's this little look they exchange when she leaves the room, as if, there she goes, gonna go crying in the toilet now. It's totally gaslighting.
And there's several instances in the film of mansplainers, like even her boyfriend, who is, I think, a psychology professor. And like when she's describing her experiences, that when Christine is undergoing these like very bizarre events, and she gets the feeling that there's an entity following her and disturbing her peace at home, when she tells her boyfriend, he just kind of tells her, oh no, you've just been through a trauma, and you're just reliving your trauma. And he completely minimizes her experience and invalidates her. There seems to be this kind of thing as well where she is not taken seriously by a lot of the men in the story.
He does, though, kind of acquiesce to her paranoia, and he kind of goes along with her, distrusts everything all the way. But he does try to support her. I mean, what do you make of him as a character in general? Do you think he sort of falls in line with her manager and Stu?
Not quite, no. At first he seems not fully in support of what she is actually bringing forward as her true experience. And I think he's quite logical. He's trying to find, like, let's say, scientific explanations for what's happening, and he's trying to find the logic in this narrative, which initially seems really like psychotic, So at first I felt like I wasn't sure about him and I kind of mistrusted him, but I think you're right. I think eventually along the narrative, he does recognize that she's really suffering, and when she isn't able to fundraise for the spiritualist who's meant to be helping her, she goes and sells all her possessions, and it only comes up to about $3,800. That was also heartbreaking as well, just to have like a number like that quoted to you as your worth. And it does, and she's falling short, and it's really embarrassing. It kind of just mirrors what happened in the initial incident where Mrs. Ganush, of course, she was falling short too in her payments. So when he seems to rely on his affluence or his monetary background to come in, and he does pay the spiritualist. So that is good,
And do you think the fact that Christine works in a bank, the fact that she's a loan officer, the fact that the inciting incident is a refusal to extend a mortgage payment, and let's remember that this film came out in the middle of a giant recession that was partially prompted by a huge mortgage crisis.
Absolutely.
So it seems like very deliberate choices to set the characters in that scenario and to, like you say, give a very specific monetary value to their lives and their experiences. What do you think the meaning behind that is?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think those choices were deliberate, and I think it's actually quite smart to tell a story of the anguish and suffering that was caused by the subprime mortgage crisis, and using the horror genre as a language to express that sorrow and grief. I think what's really interesting is constant return of a certain turn of phrase or word, such as possession or repossession. Initially, we see Mrs. Ganush and her fear that her house will be repossessed. Then, when her loan extension is denied, Christine is obviously met with all these difficulties, and Mrs. Ganush attempts to possess Christine and her soul via the evil Lamia spirit. Then Christine tries to raise those funds for the spiritualist by selling her possession. So the same word keeps coming back again and again. There's this term in banking called foreclosure, which is the action of taking possession of a mortgage property when the person's not able to keep up with their payments. Weirdly enough, the exact term appears in Lacanian psychoanalysis. Jacques Lacan, who was a Freudian, he introduced this term to identify the specific cause for psychosis. He said that it regards the fact that the subject no longer sees as part of their universally shared reality. So he says basically that in a psychotic person, a certain lawful dimension is foreclosed. It's cast out of their awareness. So they no longer accept the reality that we all exist in. And they start to, like, that lawful element is foreclosed. It leaves them. And that creates a hole in their discourse that cannot be filled. Just like the hole that opens up and swallows her, drags her to hell, it causes a psychotic structure in the individual. This is apparently what causes delusions and hallucinations, which are throughout this film. And these appear because they're trying to communicate that the self itself is crumbling and attempting to hold itself together in whatever way it can. They're basically just trying to, like, button themselves up, which is interesting because the object is a button.
Yes. I was about to say.
Yeah.
And she literally, the thing that will pass on the curse will be gaining or handing over possession of this cursed object, right? Which is a button from her coat. And, you know, this is a very spoilerific podcast anyway. The kind of the last twist of the film is that actually she never got rid of the curse and it's still with her. And it's that heartbreaking last scene where she's come to terms with herself and the fact that she acted out of self-interest. And she appears to be saved. We're following all the narrative tropes of horror films. We can relax. We're good. And then the literal ground beneath her feet opens up and she's dragged by demons into hellfire.
It's shocking. I really didn't see that ending coming. When I didn't know the spoilers when I went into it. And when it came, I couldn't believe it. It was so heartbreaking because we saw that she finally had this opportunity to live out, like, a positive path for herself, and she put all this stuff behind her, but it never left her. So all the time that she felt the fabric of her reality being ripped apart, in the end, she wasn't able to fasten herself up. You know, she still had this missing button that left open this gap, this kind of discursive or narrative gap where Mrs. Ganush could come back and drag her back. And I think a lot of this has to do also with maybe something about also the fact that she did come from a past where she was overweight, and this still plays on her mind. That heaviness could also be maybe an allusion to something she's carrying with her all the time, baggage she hasn't been able to let go of. And this might be part of her pathology. And maybe this is why she feels so self-conscious about body image, because it really doesn't have anything to do with it necessarily with anything vain. It's more what she's carrying with her. It's
more about taking up the space,
exactly,
both physically and psychologically. A lot of the kind of the class issues that came through very... Maybe because I watched it now that I'm older, definitely went way above my head when I watched it when it originally came out. But that sense of being very conscious of where you are on the social ladder.
Wow.
Especially if her partner in this film is very much presented as being from a very upper class family. And the dinner scene where she goes to meet his family is so heartbreaking.
It is.
It doesn't let go midway through when there seems to be a moment of genuine connection between her and his mother. But up to that point, it's like an interrogation room.
Yeah.
Well, ever since my dad died, she doesn't talk much. She just, stays on the farm and keeps to herself because...
Because her husband died, Mom, and she just wants to be by herself. Why don't...
Because my mother's an alcoholic.
Oh. I'm sorry. It's certainly nothing to be ashamed of. I have to say, I find your honesty very refreshing. My father had a drinking problem, and I was always too ashamed to admit it. You've got backbone. Unlike that last girl he brought by. What was her name?
Yeah, that's right. The harvest cake that she brings over isn't sophisticated enough. You know, she's obviously tried very hard to impress. She looks great, but then she makes this comment about her cat, and it's awkward.
Yeah.
It's only at the moment, as you say, that when she reveals that Christine reveals that her mother was an alcoholic, that her boyfriend's mother, it says, oh, that's really refreshing to hear someone say that. It's really honest. My father had a drinking problem.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that it's the trauma that binds the women there, and that's the real genuine thing. It's no pretense and there's no illusions to anything. It's something human. But unfortunately, for Christine, the hallucinations are too violent, and she does lash out, and it must have been heartbreaking. And it is so. That's the thing about this film, is that even though there's so many OTT moments and gross out moments, there's still a lot of human value in it that comes through.
There's a lot of heart in it.
Yeah,
which is one of the things I really love about Sam Raimi's cinema anyway.
Yeah.
And one of the most interesting readings, again, that I think came out a little while after its general release, was that the whole film the horror is actually about the lasting trauma of eating disorders.
Yeah.
And, statistically, not that they don't affect men, but statistically mostly affect women, mostly affect young women. What do you make of that reading? Had you encountered it before, or has it kind of impacted your viewing, maybe upon rewatch?
Yeah, it did occur to me that there were a lot of references to food, but it seemed like in a pathological way, whether it was just like a nuanced thing or something very serious, like when we see her, she's in distress and she's got this gallon of ice cream, she's binge eating.
Yeah.
And it did occur to me, there's something there about preoccupation with food and eating disorders. And I think it is a really good conclusion to say that it's probably... She, as a person, she hasn't been really empowered to believe that she can take up the space that she needs. So, and maybe also because of the influence of our culture and what women are meant to look like and standards of beauty, I think in her case, she's done everything she can to shrink herself down, not just in appearance, but also in her role, in her job. And we see that she's trying to take risks. She's trying to come out and take her rightful place as an empowered person. But I don't think it's something that she's quite mastered yet. So the disordered eating, I think, is a reflection of that it's either a compulsion to restrict, or out of control, binge episode,
Or lack of control, yeah.
Yeah.
And sorry to bring this on you, I just thought of you as you were speaking, because it's so interesting. Do you think there's a particular, maybe because it's your expertise, do you think there's a particular psychoanalytical reading to the fact that Kristen, who's tried so hard to shrink herself into other people's expectations of her, do you think there's a particular reading to Mrs. Ganush being presented as so over the top in every single possible way, as in too old to even be going into the bank to ask for a mortgage extension, essentially literally falling apart. Like her teeth are fake. She takes them out. They're all covered in spit. You know, her nails look basically dead.
Yeah.
She all looks, you know, one of her eyes is gone. It's kind of replaced with a glass eye.
Yeah.
That's very aggressively kind of there. She's so over the top witchy, and kind of a lot of the body horror comes from her just looking like she does.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a distinct kind of element of pitting this woman who is going against every single kind of image norm that is placed upon women, being the one that confronts this very young, ambitious young woman who is working really hard to fit in?
Yes, I do. In the sense that the way Mrs. Ganush looks, she almost, like when she appears at the bank, there's almost no distinction from that moment until when we see her at her memorial, when she's in the casket. She looks exactly the same. It's as if she was just an animated corpse all along. She was already kind of just dead. As you precisely describe her physical features, they're decaying. And the thing about eating disorders is that it's a pathology of nourishment, you know, so, and food representing a functional, hopefully healthy, nutritious way to nourish yourself and bring livelihood, you know, actually ingest livelihood into your body. In an eating disorder, it's a very ambivalent relationship with that, and it's usually very pathological. It's either an outright refusal to eat and introduce the nourishment into your body and make yourself healthy and alive, or it's a pathologized thing where you either want to restrict the life force or you overdose on the life force. You're binging, you're eating too much, and it makes you sick. So I think Mrs. Ganush looking the way she does, and yeah, I think the fact that with all the projectile and vomiting, there's an oral element in there, you know?
It's like a physical manifestation of an eating disorder
Exactly.
in some ways, you know, so there's a lot of those elements that become very visceral and very much kind of embodied in a way by Mrs. Ganush.
Yeah, exactly. It's this thing about she being the symptom of an eating disorder. Like and that symptom is doing all the talking of Christine's pathology, her trauma, the things that she wants to repress. They're kind of all embodied in one person, this living or, you know, animated person who looks like a corpse, who's begging her for help. You know, usually that's the thing. With mental illness, it's usually at a point of crisis where the subject is, you know, maybe needing a lot of support and a lot of help. It's a point of crisis. So, that bank scene it's kind of like a really, really clever allegory for a lot of things. That's the bit that impressed me the most. It has so much tension in it. And it also provides like those little bits of horror that we enjoy in terms of entertainment, but there's a lot more value to it than just surface level. Yeah.
And do you think that ultimately the film is Mrs. Ganush, a witch, taking her revenge on someone who insulted her, who insulted her pride and her sense of self? Or do you think it's about punishing a young woman for being too ambitious?
I think it's kind of both. The thing about the thing that really struck me about Christine's response at the bank is I don't think it was ever said outright in the script, but because she was motivated to get that promotion, she wanted to impress her boss and show him that she was capable of demonstrating these more tough qualities to be an assistant manager. She was just trying to do her job. To me, this sounds almost something out of like Hannah Arendt, you know, The Banality of Evil, and the whole business that people who wouldn't qualify themselves as evil ended up being responsible for the Second World War in this kind of complex network of bureaucracy that ended up causing the Holocaust. They were
Of people just doing what they were told to do instead of questioning orders.
Exactly. They were just, in their mind, they didn't view or perceive themselves as being evil. But they were committing and perpetuating wrongdoing and evil deeds because they just believed they were just doing their job. And to me, this banality of evil is what ultimately, I think that Christine punishes herself. I think that a lot of what Mrs. Ganush stands for is a kind of depraved representation of her, maybe her superego, her conscience, that she's internalized. She's meant to be, she probably thinks she's a decent person. She murdered her cat. It's so sad.
And, if the internet and Netflix has told us anything,
Oh God,
is that
don't
you do not fuck with cats.
No way.
You do not.
Oh my God, Christine is like Luca Magnotta. Oh my God, we've come full circle with that.
No. She does take in defense of Christine. Oh God, no. I had to look away.
I know.
I've seen some terrible, depraved horror films in my time, but I cannot see a cat being hurt.
No way.
Ever.
That was too much. It was way too excessive and disgusting, and I lost sleep over that. I mean, I was kind of warned that was going to be shocking, but that was really brutal. And so in a way, I just think that she's kind of pushed. Christine, in a way, ends up
she's really pushed against all her limits, isn't she?
Yeah, and she ends up committing acts that she probably never thinks she'd do. And she's convinced that, the only thing that's going to get rid of this Lamia is a blood sacrifice, a blood offering or whatever. And that's what makes her kill her cat. So it's like she's constantly pushing the boundaries of her morality. And I think that even though it looks like it's some outside supernatural force that's punishing her, I think actually it's not. It's probably more an internalized guilt that's destroying her.
And just to wrap up, what did you make of the spiritualist that Christine consults and then teams up with, Ram Jazz, kind of, because he's the one with the knowledge about the other world.
That's right. And he's a benevolent force. So he's like the good witch in a way. He's sort of acting out in favor, of Christine and trying to help her. I really liked him. I liked the actor who plays him in the film. And I liked his character a lot. Initially, he was sort of also pitted against the boyfriend because, do you remember when they first went to see him? And he actually, I think it was the boyfriend who said, he actually quoted Freud, and he said, "Destiny is not an act of fate, rather something created by our subconscious to control our conscious choices." And then the spiritualist says, yes, but not everything can be understood by the intellect. And he's quoting Carl Jung.
Yes.
Which was great.
They have a little psychoanalytical dick swing competition there.
Oh my God. Absolutely.
That was a beautiful moment.
Was not expecting that, but I thought it was kind of good. But I like the fact that he says that because right away he's telling us everything we need to know about him, that he's not necessarily operating purely on the realm of logic and science and everything that we can see with our eyes and perceive. It's he kind of is an adventure of something else, some darker force, some unseen, unconscious realm, and he's trying to tell Christine, look, this is what's happening, and if you don't accept it, you're not going to be able to get help, and I can guide you through it. And he also organizes that seance. Mm-hmm. And I think that in a way, a lot of what he's doing in the film represents an aspect of madness that is actually quite productive, because he's basically saying what you need to do is look inward at your symptoms and not disregard them. You need to work with them, and he even gives her this mantra about, he says, I will accept death into my soul. And I think that's really important psychoanalytically, because her problem is that she's in the abject space. She's between two spaces. She's undead. Mm-hmm. And to have closure on her symptoms, she needs to reach a point where she accepts she kind of goes through the course of what those symptoms are and lets those die. Oftentimes in mental illness, our symptoms persist because we haven't let go of something. Something hasn't quite died for us. We're keeping them alive by acting out symptoms. And so in a way, he's kind of a psychoanalyst. He's kind of saying, you need to surrender to these forces and let them consume you, and then you can finally kind of be free from them. And so in a way, I think he serves a really positive role. He's trying to guide her through this really uncharted territory for her that scares her. He's quite like a friendly force for her.
He's like a good witch, like you mentioned before.
A good witch.
And it's just a tale of a little bit into him, and he brings her to a much more established and older medium, who we actually meet in a younger version of herself in the first scene of the film, which makes no sense, and then it all comes back for full circle.
Yes.
And in that seance that they organize, where they're confronting the spiritual world, the spirit that's been, set to hunt down Christine, there's quite a few elements that seem extremely familiar if you've been binge watching witch films and occult films like I have. So there's, elements like a grimoire, so a book of sort of forbidden knowledge. And, they're surrounded by books, but the fact that they constantly refer to books of magic and spells and conjuring, and there's also not just the seance itself, but there's the figure of the goat, which is very often associated, which is really there to be sacrificed, but it's very often associated with witches and with devil worship. And we talked a lot about it in a previous episode of the podcast on The Witch, because in Robert Eggers' The Witch, he becomes the embodiment of Satan and is known as Black Phillip. And in a really roundabout way, I wanted to ask, how does the film utilize those artifacts and signifiers of witchcraft and occultism?
Yeah, I guess I agree with your take in terms of those objects that are represented and the things that we see in terms of symbols and that are kind of referring to previous representations, whether in literature, film, or other art forms, to refer to witchcraft. And I think at the center of that, my I guess regard for witchcraft is that it's an exercise in trying to invoke powers that are outside of our realm and trying in a very conscious way to cast a spell or to manifest something that we visualized. And it's our intent. And it's very goal oriented. So it's like it's not ambivalent in that regard. It's not like a nihilistic outlook. It's very specific, and that really came across to me when I watched the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. Like, love it, absolutely love it. And what I like about all of that is that it's intentional. It's all very intentional. Those objects and signifiers are there to prompt us into a mode of activity that invokes powers outside of ourselves and to bring about a result that we want. And I think already Christine is already doing that right from the opening frame of the film. If you remember, she's in the car, she's listening to, is it like a guided enunciation exercise? And something about round, and she's pronouncing words. Yes. It's like she wants to get rid of her farmer accent.
Yeah, it's something like
the eyes
diction,
around. Yeah, diction.
Like diction will make perfection, or clear diction will make perfection. Yeah. Something very snappy but motivational like that.
Yeah, exactly. And also just like repeated phrases to perfect and master certain pronunciations of words. And her whole commute into her workday in the morning is her in her car, very intentionally driving and multitasking. She's driving, but she's also trying to perfect herself. She's repeating this mantra, to herself in her car. She's trying to improve herself. And it's kind of like an incantation, and she's sort of like, she's willing herself into that mindset to try and access powers that maybe she feels she's not quite mastered yet, but she's on that path. She wants to be able to embody that power. It's just her journey's a little bit bumpy. And so when she's at her workplace, she's also told that this is what you need to do to get ahead. And she struggles within herself, but she understands that on the path to power, difficult decisions have to be made. And sometimes difficult outcomes have to be confronted. And that for me is the essence of witchcraft. You know, it's very intentional. It's not like other horror tropes where characters are a little bit like at sea, you know, like vampires. They're sort of like at the mercy to their desires. They're kind, in a way, they've kind of given up the ghost. Whereas witches, they're a little bit more in a power position because they will themselves into mastery and into perfection.
Beautifully put.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful way to wrap up. Thank you so much, Mary, for your time. And tell us, where can people find more of your work?
Thank you so much. You can follow me on my Twitter at Psychstar. That's PSYCSTAR. On there, I post about events that I run. I run a lecture series called Projections, which is applying psychoanalysis to film interpretation. Usually it's at venues like the Freud Museum, City Lit, and Picture House Cinemas. And I also co-host a podcast with my friend Sarah Cleaver. And you can find us everywhere, basically, on all podcast apps. We're Projections Podcast.
Repeat the following phrases precisely as spoken. There is no friction with the proper diction.
There is no
And that's it for
friction
another
with
episode of the
proper
Final
diction.
Ghost podcast.
Good
Please do
sounds
rate and
abound
subscribe on
when the
iTunes,
mouth
Spotify,
is
or
round.
wherever you get your podcasts.
Good sounds
You can find out more about what we do
abound
on
when the mouth is
thefinalghost.co.uk and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Final Ghost UK. You can also follow Mary on Twitter at Psychstar, and I am on Anna B. Demented. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for more witchy goodness next week.